just before I introduce Sarah, if there were any questions, what we'll do is she's got 3 presentations. We'll take a break for Q&A in each of those, and so that it just becomes more engaging for people that are watching live. This is a live discussion. If you have any questions, please use the chat box, raise your hand, and point the question to whatever appropriate speaker you would like to have. So a brief background about Sarah. Sarah's been the CEO of Pharmac. She was appointed in January 2018, and before that, she was the Director of Operations for Pharmac New Zealand 2013. Pharmac is the body that approves all the ranges of drugs in New Zealand. Under her leadership, Pharmac has expanded the number and range of funded medicines available in New Zealand, and widely access to current funded medicines managed or funding medicines in New Zealand hospitals, laid the groundwork of Pharmac to manage hospital medical services. Sarah is driving an important program to make Pharmac decisions clear and faster. She's committed to reducing inequalities of access to funded medicines. Before joining Pharmac, Sarah spent about 12 years as the chief pharmacist at Auckland Hospital and worked as a clinical pharmacist in NHS, specializing in HIV, intensive care, and hepatology. Sarah's overseas leadership is directly answerable to Pharmac board. It's a great privilege and honor to have Sarah Fitt join us. Sarah, you've been very widely respected in New Zealand, and people like myself who have had access to drugs in various conditions are very grateful to the decisions that Pharmac makes. You can't please everyone, but I hope with a strong collaboration with some generic drugs in India, we can save many lives. Over to you, Sarah.
Great. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Samir. Thank you to the India-New Zealand Business Council for the invitation, and also thank you to Your Excellency for joining us today from MIQ. I'll just share the screen. So first of all, before I start, I'd just like to really emphasize at the beginning of my presentation how much we value our relationship with our pharmaceutical suppliers and manufacturers in India. And certainly over the last year, it certainly enabled us to develop more of those relationships directly with you. And we very much look forward to developing and strengthening our relationships with you going forward. So what I was going to do today, as Samir said, is that I've divided my presentation into 3 sections to give the opportunity to ask questions after each section. So first of all, I'll just give a little bit of a brief introduction on New Zealand, Pharmac's role, where we sit in the health system here. And then really the main bulk of my presentation will be to talk about our tender, which is really where we make all the decisions about particularly generic medicines. And I think that's probably the bit of our work that's going to be of most interest to people on the call. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in the hospital medical devices space, again, because that may be of interest to some of the people on the call. So New Zealand is hidden away at the bottom of the world. We're a very small country. We're a population of only 5 million, which is tiny compared to the population of India. And we're one of the world's least populated countries for its size. Our healthcare system is government funded through general taxation, which means residents receive pretty much free or subsidised medical care. All hospital care is free. There is a small charge to visit your community doctor. And on the whole, 3 months of funded medicine here is $5, so very accessible. Our private healthcare system is quite limited and is quite small. So most people here will access the public healthcare system for their healthcare needs. So Pharmac is part of this system, and as we've said from earlier speakers, Pharmac is the government agency that decides what medicines and in some cases what medical devices are available on the publicly funded system to New Zealanders, and what we do is aim to make them affordable and accessible. So our place in the healthcare system is a Crown entity. So we were created in 1993 as in response to a concern over rising prices of medicines throughout the 1980s. In 2000, it was included in law, and as I said, as a Crown entity, so we have a board and we report directly into the Minister of Health. We also work very closely with our district health boards. So we have currently 20 district health boards, which are made up of hospitals and primary care services in New Zealand. And we also work very closely with the Ministry of Health. An important part of that, the ministry, which again, many people may be interested in, is our relationship with MedSafe, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time. So as I said, we were set up in 1993. We have a relatively small team of staff of about 150 staff working at Pharmac. So as I said, our budget is set each year by the Minister of Health. Obviously, he looks after the whole of the health budget for New Zealand. And that pool of health, Vote Health for New Zealand, is currently $24.4 billion. The Minister also decides the budget for Pharmac on a recommendation that we give to him each year. And currently that's just over $1 billion. And from that $1 billion, we manage the funding of all medicines throughout New Zealand, both in the community and also hospitals within that budget. And we're also now negotiating national contracts for hospital medical devices. Now, as I mentioned, MedSafe, we are completely separate to MedSafe. So MedSafe is our regulator here in New Zealand, and we work independently of each other, but we do work very closely together. So an important part of any company wanting to export medicines into New Zealand is that regulatory pathway, because any medicine we will fund here has to be registered here. So that liaison is very important, and I've put their website up on the screen there, so you can find out more information about MedSafe there. So this was a little slide we pulled together. This just shows the huge difference in population size, also the difference in GDP per person, the difference in the healthcare system, and the difference in healthcare spend. So our healthcare spend is about 10% of GDP. So as I said at the beginning, we very much value our relationship with the Indian manufacturers. And we estimate that 60% of medicines funded in New Zealand have some sort of involvement from an Indian manufacturer, whether that's the final product, whether it's the active ingredient, or whether the excipients. And certainly last year, as I said, through the early stages of the pandemic, particularly sort of March, April, May of last year, we had much more direct engagement with our suppliers. Usually that in the past has been done through the sponsors in New Zealand. But with some of the issues we were having, particularly around supply chain, logistics, freight, we actually engaged MFAT staff, our foreign affairs staff, directly in India to work directly with the manufacturers and suppliers to enable us to get stock into New Zealand. Certainly when we had the issues with the flights disappearing, it became crucial that we were able to access priority flights to get our medicines into New Zealand. And we're very, very appreciative of all the help we received, of all the companies that we dealt with. People went way above and beyond to ensure that medicines were able to continue to get to New Zealand. And I think it's a testament to our relationship and the effort that people put in that we didn't actually have any out-of-stock situations from our manufacturers in India. So everybody here hugely appreciates the time and effort that people put in to ensuring that supply chain continued. So going back to a bit about Pharmac, so as I said, we're set up in legislation. So what we try to do is under legislation, we're required to ensure that we get the best health outcomes that can be achieved from pharmaceutical treatment, and importantly from within that amount of funding provided. So as I said, we work under a fixed budget, which is quite different to many other healthcare systems. So we have to ensure that we work within that budget. We can't go over that budget, we can't go under that budget. So we work hard to make sure that we stay within budget, but deliver the best health outcomes that we can. So our areas of responsibility, really the community medicine side is probably the area that's of most interest, but over the years we've expanded our scope. So originally we were community medicines, but now we've moved into hospital medicines, blood products, vaccines, which is obviously an area of interest. And as I said, we're moving much more into that space of medical devices, which I'll talk about a bit later. As we all know, healthcare wants exceed resources available, so choices have to be made. There are always going to be more demands on the health budget than we have the resources to pay for, no matter which country in the world you live in. And we have to make sure that we are making spending choices that are the best choices available. And I think it's important to reiterate, it's not necessarily about the cheapest product, it's actually we want to ensure we have the best product for our people. So this really explains what our budget management model is because of that working under a fixed budget. So obviously what we want to do is to fund the new medicines that become available. We want to encourage competition because competition increases the efficiency of our budget. Competition produces savings, and these savings can then be used to reinvest in new medicines. These new medicines then help promote further competition, and down the track can themselves lead to savings. So an important part of that way we generate savings is through our annual tender, which about shortly. And really that is a way that we can get savings with off-patent medicines to enable us to fund new innovator models. So all the work we do really is about making sure we can fund new medicines, we can keep up with any volume increases, and we can ensure that we're providing good quality medicines to the people of New Zealand. So as I said, what we want to do is by getting lower prices with our fixed budget, we can fund more medicines for more people and increase the value of our budget that we have available. So what I thought it might be useful to do here is just give an example of a medicine that will be familiar to many of you, simvastatin. So if simvastatin came onto the market back in 2000, and it was quite an expensive medicine at that time. So we did usual negotiating price reductions from $2.50 a tablet down to a sort of $1.80 per tablet. Then what we continued, we started to have generic competition coming into the market. And then gradually the prices dropped with our sole supply tendering. So this is what we're doing with our model. At this stage, when the medicine was first introduced, it was expensive, so access was limited to patients who were going to get the most benefit from it. And by it decreasing the price, we could widen the access. So we've gone from around 40,000 people on it to nearly 300,000. So this generic competition and tendering has lowered the price, with the net effect of it being a 99% price reduction, but use has increased tenfold. So now it's open listed and available to anyone that needs it. So that's for one particular medicine. But also what we do is get that competition going in a class of medicine. So as you can see from the graph, the simvastatin, the number of prescriptions has increased over time. The atorvastatin, again, was introduced at that time. And again, as we've had the price negotiations, we've had that generic competition, the usage of atorvastatin has increased as well. So now we have far more prescriptions available, 140,000 prescriptions, as opposed to sort of that 20,000 prescriptions. So as you can see, that gives a good illustration of our model. By getting that competition in, by getting the price drop, we can widen access and make it more available. So that's what we're constantly looking to do. The next graph shows, that's just the talked about. So this is a good example of the range of products that we're looking at. We've already talked about paracetamol, which has certainly provided some major challenges for us in the last year. We actually dispense 1 million paracetamol tablets a day. So it's a huge volume item for us, and certainly when we're looking at changing from one supplier to another, that's a huge, well, from our point of view, it's a big manufacturing change supplier. But this gives you a very good example of our top 20 medicines dispensed by the number of prescriptions. And really, they're all very common medicines. So these are the medicines that would go into our tender, which I'll talk about a bit more in the next section. So this gives you a good example. So I'm happy to take any questions now, if that works.
We are open for questions if anyone wants to either type or I think there was one from Kajal in India, Kajal Anand, I think. Kajal Anand, if you got a question, I think I just got it texted. Yeah, just a second, I'll ask that question. The question was, when a new company, or for the matters of the fact, any company is awarded a tender, considerable amount of orders should be taken into consideration to enable the seller manufacturer to run at least their minimum batch size, both for H and C selling. Reason being the freight cost and manufacturing costs get much higher than the bidded cost. So what's your thoughts on that, Sarah?
Yeah, certainly. I think we're certainly expecting that we're going to see an impact with regard to freight prices over the change in the last year. We've certainly are very conscious that the freight prices have increased quite dramatically, both by air and by sea. So I think we are expecting to see that price impact come through. But I mean, obviously, we expect when people submit to a tender that they're putting a price in that's reasonable, that they're not going to be making a loss on it. It has to be a sustainable market for any manufacturer. But I think we're aware that we will start to see increases in prices just because of the difficulties around supply chain and freight to get product into New Zealand.
I think you'll cover the tendering process later on, right?
Yeah,
okay,
that's next. Yeah.
All right. Let's go on to the next slide.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
I was going to talk on was in a bit more detail now around our procurement process, the tender, and our contracting. So obviously, as I said, we're responsible for procurement of $1 billion worth of medicines, and we have a number of different competitive processes we run. So we'll talk about the tender, but we also run a lot of competitive processes for medicines that aren't generic, and certainly that's a way of us also getting savings. So recently we ran a competitive process for diabetes medicine. So these are products that are still on patent, but we get clinical advice from our experts to say, listen, you don't need to fund 16 different types of diabetes medicines as long as you've got a medicine from each of the classes funded. That's sufficient. So again, by running a competitive process with patented medicines, that gives us, frees up money that we can then invest in new medicines. The tender I'll talk about in a minute. We also do a lot of negotiating, direct contracting. We often will have rebates on products because we get quite good pricing here. Some of our suppliers may not want that pricing to be visible to other countries where there's a much bigger market. So we've got ways that we can just put a list price in and we can work a rebate system, expenditure caps. Another tool that we use is multi-product agreements. So sometimes people might have a group of products that they want to get funded, and what we'll do is rather than not just negotiate on each individual product, we'll negotiate as a bundle, and sometimes that can work very well for suppliers who've got a number of products. And as I said, we also are starting to run contracts for medical devices as well. So what's our tender? So a tender is a procurement process, and it's our process of inviting an offer or bid, which is binding if accepted. The first Pharmac tender was in 1997 and had one line item, which was paracetamol. So we've come a long way since then. Our annual tender is now developed in a process involving over usually 500 or so line items every year, and it's a 3-year sole supply. So each product usually comes up for tender for sole supply every 3 years. It's a quick and efficient way to secure supply and drive value from markets. And as I've said before, where savings are achieved through the tender, we're able to manage expenditure in a growing market, but also free up funding so we can invest in new medicines. So important, as I said, it's a competitive price for a 3-year period. And in exchange for that, it's an exclusive supply. So any supplier that wins that tender gets the whole New Zealand market for that 3-year period. So from a supplier's point of view, it gives you certainty, you know what your volumes are going to be. You don't have to have staff on the ground going to try and persuade people to prescribe your medicine because it's the only one that's funded on the schedule. In return for that, there's an increased responsibility on the supplier to maintain supply, and certainly that's been borne out in the last year. We're a country, and we rely on all our medicines pretty much are imported, so that supply becomes even more critical in the situation we've had the last year. But as I said, it worked. Our suppliers were able to meet their contractual arrangements. So the tender works very well for us because it's an efficient process. The terms and conditions are set out in advance, so everybody knows what they're signing up to. So it's quite clear for suppliers as well what the terms and conditions are. Last year, so we had, as I said, we normally have about 500 items. So last year we had 539 items in the tender. We received 354 bids, and that generated $31.5 million in savings, which can then be used to fund new medicines. As I said, it's important that people realise that it's a sole supply, so it's a national contract for one supplier for that medicine for 3 years, and it's 100% of the whole market. So we need to be really sure that the supplier can deliver that. So as I said, it's not necessarily about the cheapest price. It's actually really important that we have got a relationship with the supplier, that we know that they've got a good record and that they'll be able to meet their commitment. And we do that through our contracts, but also our relationships. So there's obligations for the supplier to maintain a level of stock in the country. They have to notify us if stock falls below certain levels. And there are quite major financial implications if that supply chain falls over. So really it's about that communication, and I think that's been really important and what we valued in the last year or so, that we will work with if there's a problem. We had that with paracetamol. We want to help, we'll work with suppliers, we can pull levers with government, we can organise freight if needs be, but it's important that people communicate with us if they do have a supply problem, because we have the whole market is with one supplier, so all the patients are on that medicine. There aren't other options if there's a stock problem. So this next graph shows the process, because as I said, it's an annual cycle. So what we do is we draft the list in sort of May to July, and then what we do is we actually consult on the draft list between July and August. This all goes up on our website. We listen to what feedback we get on our draft consultation. We finalise it in October, and then our tender is issued in early November. So that's really the critical point where the tender goes out. The bids come in back in mid-December. We often will ask for samples. So we look at those. Our clinical committee looks at that. And then from that sort of January to June period is when we award the tenders for the next 3 years. And then we start the cycle all over again. So this is the constant cycle that goes on through the year with our tender team. All our procurement proposals, whether it's the tender or other procurement proposals, go up on the New Zealand Government electronic tender service. So definitely it's worth registering with that if you haven't already done so. And as I said, we put all our procurement processes go to that government tender. We also have developed our own e-tendering solution, which is on our site. So that way it ensures that it's secure. We don't hold this. It's hosted by an independent party. So suppliers use that to submit their bids. So it's got lots of security, and we can't even access it till the tenders close. So again, that's available through our website, and people can sign up to register to get updates through that system. So as I said, contracting is very important. Contracting gives us that the confidence and the security of the supply chain. which we need to be ensure that patients continue to access their medicine. And we think that our system works well. And in fact, we have fewer stock problems than other countries, particularly Australia. And we think this is because of our contracts, but also our relationship with our suppliers. So we have a team of contract managers. We've got a big team of contract managers. That team has increased in the last year, and we put a lot of resources into managing our supply contracts and having the relationship with our suppliers. So what that does, it enables us to respond quickly when there's an issue. We work with the suppliers to try and solve the problem. So our contracts also act as an early warning system, and I think that's where we've seen that advantage, that we can work with our suppliers to avoid us getting to an out-of-stock solution, because that's not good for anyone. So we're keen to have a good open dialogue and ensure that it's a two-way relationship, and the suppliers also benefit from that relationship as well. So there are quite a lot of myths and legends that fly around about our tender process. So I thought I'd do a bit of a myth busting session. So as I said, people think that we take the lowest bid price. Obviously, price is important, but there are other factors that we take into account. So again, we'll look at things like, what is the supply record of the company? What are the logistics into New Zealand like? Things like, what are the pack size like? Because that's important when we're working with our dispensing pharmacists. So it isn't all about the price. It is important that we take other factors into consideration as well. Another myth that we have is that we don't have any clinical input into our tender decisions. And again, the reality is we actually have a committee that works with Pharmac that includes practicing doctors, nurses and pharmacists that give us advice on the products that we want to put into the tender. But also they look at the samples, they make sure that it's going to work for patients. You know, if it's a new liquid, they get to taste it. If a tablet's meant to dissolve, does it dissolve properly? So we actually have a session where we look at all the samples and actually trial them out practically to make sure that we're making the best decisions. As I said, there's quite a lot of commentary that sole supply agreements will increase the risk of out-of-stock situation because we only have one supplier. But in fact, we think the opposite to that. If we have one supplier, there's an incentive on them to commit to supplying New Zealand ahead of other markets. And with the safeguards we put in place to mitigate out of stocks and potential out of stocks, we believe we have less out of stocks than other countries. Another fact that people raise is that because we've been running the tender for a long time, the savings will harder to maintain, and in fact we've actually seen no signs of that decreasing up until this year. I think that as we've just talked about, that things may change a bit around the freight issue, but the sole supply agreements have been shown to incentivize suppliers, and actually we continue to see more people wanting to come into the market. So even though people might lose the tender, often they'll come back in 3 years later. And also all the time, there are new products coming off patent. So although we have a lot of products that have been on the tender for a long time, each year there are new products coming off patent and they go into the tender. And the other one, yeah, the competition will be reduced. We in fact see the opposite. Each year we get more and more suppliers coming into the market, even though relatively speaking, it's a small population. For a lot of suppliers, they see that there's an advantage in they know what they're getting. They know that it's 100% of the market for 3 years. It makes it a lot easier. So, like I said, we were always seeing new suppliers coming into the market. Something we do have to consider as well is the level of competition. So obviously, if we keep giving the same supplier the market every year, every 3 years, there is a risk that other suppliers will pull out of the market. So that is something we have to weigh up because we want to keep that competition in the market. So we find ways to work with suppliers to ensure that it's a healthy competition, that it's fair, and that we make sure that we're not we share out the tender products across a number of companies. We would be putting ourselves at risk if all our products were sat with one or two companies. So we're very keen to keep companies in the market, keen to keep that competition going, and work with suppliers to ensure that we deliver that continuity of supply. So that I thought was probably the next space where we could have a break and take some questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Just for everyone, the way you can ask question is on your Zoom panel at the bottom right. It says next to record, it says reaction, and then if you click on reaction, there's a little thing that says raise hand. And if that is so, if you would like to ask Sarah some question, we can certainly do that. There's another question, Sarah, from, I don't know if you can see it, from Kajula again.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to answer that?
Pregnant orders or do not suffice the cost quoted, or the orders are too small. I mean, I guess that's, that's a business decision for you if it's too small. I mean, certainly we've not had that raised as a big issue. Most of the volume that people are happy to commit to. So I guess it depends on the size of your production. For some companies in India, probably our volumes are too small. But I guess that's the decision that you as a supplier need to make, whether you want to come into the New Zealand market or not.
Sarah, just on that, I mean, we do find a lot of in different sectors, like in textile or the same thing about proportions of manufacturing, for example. What you have rightly said, what Kajal question was, and for the benefit of everyone, what Kajal was asking was that the massive freight increase, the orders awarded do not suffice the cost quoted for the Pharmac as an order, which means that the order might be too small for an Indian firm as compared to the population of New Zealand, which is 5 million compared to. So do you think that sometimes is a kind of a road block for countries with mass production on these things for New Zealand?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, there's no doubt that there are suppliers globally that don't really want to come into the New Zealand market. But I guess the counter to that is it may be a small market, but if you win the tender, you've got 100% of the market for 3 years. So, as a manufacturing volume, it might be quite small, but you get the certainty. So I guess that's a business decision, compared to Australia, where the different states are running different tenders, you're having to compete, you're going to have staff on the ground. Here, there's an advantage that for a lot of suppliers, they like the certainty, but again, it is a tiny volume. But certainly our experience has been that each year we see more suppliers coming into the country. So it's obviously attractive to some people. But yeah, that really comes down to, and I take the point that the freight will become an issue. And again, we're going to have to work through that. And we have provided freight support in the last year. Particularly when the air freight became so expensive. It's not in our interest for people to be, making a loss exporting product into New Zealand. So I think that's something, and I don't think that's just an issue for medicines. I think it's, as you said, Samir, it's across the board. That because there's so few flights coming to New Zealand at the moment, freight is expensive, but hopefully that will start to change, and that becomes part of that wider discussion about when we open our borders. Obviously, as people are coming in, there's more flights going out. That hopefully that very expensive freight isn't going to be permanent. We will start to see more normal freight by air and sea. I know a lot of our product from India does come by sea. And again, that can work quite well as well. Again, we've been working with suppliers. If they were having issues with freight coming by sea, there was all the issues with Auckland Port and then the Suez Canal problem. We've got very good at working with Customs and Ministry of Transport and MFAT, which we've never done before COVID. Yeah. So we've got a lot more mechanisms in place. If a supplier contacts us and saying that they're having a problem, we've got more levers now that we can help them. We've literally got people to go into ports at the weekend to unload containers to get medicines out. So I think it's been quite a learning for us in the last year. But as I want to emphasize, we want to work together with the suppliers. We want to do what we can to help to ensure that we get medicines to the patients.
Sure. I just had a question I saw Sanket Patel raise his hand, but he just messaged a question saying, can we work in New Zealand in loan license model if we have EU GMP approval plant?
Well, that's where I come back to that it's important that people speak to MedSafe, because again, I think that's where the regulatory side of it, we don't manage the regulatory side of things, but certainly if you've got registration in Australia or EU, that certainly helps with that registration process. One important thing I'd say is that with our tender process, your product doesn't have to be registered for you to bid in the tender. So we accept bids from unregistered medicines. Then obviously if you're successful, you go through the registration process. So that means you don't have to go through that expense and time of having the product registered before you submit the process. Now, obviously it'd be quite good if you've already started that process, because obviously we don't want to award someone the tender and then have to wait, 2 years for them to be registered. But I think that's also helped with suppliers as well, that they don't have to get registered unless they've won the bid. So that again helps encourage people to come into the market.
Yeah. And Monica Fernandez is asking, are there companies manufacturing pharmaceuticals in New Zealand?
It's very small. Douglas is probably the main company based in Auckland, but most of their market is export. They manufacture a small amount of product that is used in New Zealand. But yeah, apart from that, there's very little manufacturing in New Zealand, which is why we're so reliant on products being imported, because we have so little manufactured within New Zealand.
Sure.
Kunal, we can ask Kunal Parmar. If you want, he can come and ask his question directly. Kunal, you can unmute and ask your question. Yeah, Kunal, you can unmute and ask your question quickly. Okay, in the meantime.
Okay, yeah, there's another question that has come. How the compliance of GMP is ensured by New Zealand health authorities?
Again, that's part of the work of MedSafe. So then they work with their colleagues, TGA, FDA. So all that quality assurance is all part of the registration process that MedSafe undertake.
Kunal's question is, does the OTC products purchasing also come through tender?
No, so we only look after the products that are prescribed. So the paracetamol market, for example, there's a lot, you can buy paracetamol over the counter here or in supermarkets. We're not involved in that over the counter product. Our remit is purely products that are prescribed by your doctor.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next. Just one more from. Is there what support New Zealand government provides if we want to set up a manufacturing unit in New Zealand?
I can't really answer that one. I mean, that might be something more for you, Samir. I mean, that's probably something that the Business Council would be able to help with more. I mean, certainly that's not something we get involved in. That would be a business decision if a company wanted to build facilities in New Zealand. I mean, I think there might be some interest in it, yeah. But it wouldn't be something we would be getting involved in.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to your next presentation. Okay. And just before we do that, if anyone's got a question, please post it on the chat, or when Sarah, after the last presentation, has some Q&A time, you can ask a question by raising your hands through the reaction button at the bottom next to record on the Zoom panel. Thank you, Sarah.
Great, thank you. I've only got a few more slides. So I thought just for the last session, we'd just talk a little bit about our hospital medical devices work, because this is really a new area that we've been getting into in the last few years. And it's an area that's going to be growing. And I know, again, there are probably many suppliers in India who make all sorts of medical devices. So I thought it was useful to mention that at this point. So the big question, what is a medical device? That's been quite a tricky question. Our legal definition here in New Zealand, it's a medical device that covers products and equipment used on, in, or by a person for a diagnostic or therapeutic purpose. So that will include all sorts of consumable, durable products, implantable devices, right up to complex equipment. So we usually say it's anything from a cotton swab to an orthopedic implant to a home dialysis machine. And our scope is all devices that are purchased for use in our hospitals here in New Zealand. It can also extend to other things that people might not necessarily think are devices. So it does include things like beds and mattresses and disability support devices. So there's a lot of devices, there's a lot of variation, a lot of context. It doesn't include devices provided in primary care or in the private setting. But again, the hospital medical devices market is quite big here as well, for the size of our country. So our spend on medicines is just over $1 billion. We think the spend on medical devices is not far off that, so about $700 or $800 million a year. So that, again, is another market that we'll be looking over into the future. So what we've been doing up until now is we've been building our schedule, so working out what products hospitals are buying. It's a completely different scenario. With medicines, we have about 1,000 different line items, 3,000 formulations. We estimate there are about 200,000 lines of medical devices. So it's quite a different scenario. So what we're doing at the moment is building this list, developing national contracts so we know what people are buying, common terms for pricing and supply. We've got all the hospitals moving onto a national contracted price and terms. As I said, we've got about 400 million under contract at the moment. We estimate it's about 700 million in total. So that so far is over 138,000 line items from over 100 suppliers. So quite a different market to our medicines market. We've also ran some competitive processes as well. Cardiac stents and wound care are good examples where there are many, many different products. We got some clinical advice, got some standardization, and then we can start to get some price advantage, which helps us again with funding new product. What we're planning to do is then move to what we do with medicines as we're looking to do with what we do with medical devices. So what we want to do is decide which medical devices are funded on the public system to get the best health outcome. Hospitals will still decide which devices they will use, but that will be chosen from a list managed by Pharmac. And what we will be doing then is managing the entry of new technology, because again, that's another huge growth area around the world. There are many new technologies being developed. Often they're quite expensive, and there needs to be a system where we can manage that entry of new technology. So Pharmac will decide what gets added to that schedule, what gets removed, but also managing the exceptions, because you know the standard device might not be suitable for everybody. You might still need to have exceptions. So we've been in this space for a few years, but it's gradually growing, and it's going to become another important part of our scope over the next few years. So the last slide, I guess if people have got more questions, really it's worth going onto our website. We've recently refreshed our website, and there's a lot of information on there, particularly around things like the tender, lots of information on the products that are in that tender. You would be able to go in and find the draft tender. You can have a look at the terms and conditions. So that starts to give you a bit more information, a bit more detail as to how our tender process works. So that the website is up there. And that really is a good starting point. That and the MedSafe website. If you've not been into New Zealand or you're thinking of maybe expanding to this market, the websites are a good place to go to at least start off. And then obviously we're happy to take queries from people if they want to follow up in more detail once they've had a look at the website. So I think that was the last. Yep. So that, again, happy to take any questions.